For people who have not read Revolt Against the Masses, one of the key points in the book is that the most influential liberal of the 1920s, one of the founding liberals before the New Deal, was H.L. Mencken. That it was H.L. Mencken who gave liberalism many of his classic tropes. John Kenneth Galbraith, the convention, mocking the conventional wisdom. That was right out of Mencken.
In this fourth segment of our conversation with Fred Siegel, we turn directly to his recent book, Revolt Against the Masses, and consider his thesis that the decade of the 1920s is the key to understanding the origins of contemporary liberalism. This tour includes some blunt assessments of H.L. Mencken and Richard Hofstadter, among others. Fred, let's spend a good long time talking about your latest book, The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class, coming out soon on paperback. Is it too much to say that this is something of a summa of your work in a lot of ways?
Yeah, yes and no, I think. I've been thinking about these kind of questions for a long time, and it was clear to me that the New Left represented a fundamental break with New Deal liberalism. What was good about New Deal liberalism, and what's happened since then is a kind of rights-based identity politics liberalism, which is little concerned with the overall public good, overall well-being of the society, and is simply involved in feeding particular interest groups, whether they be trial lawyers or feminists or single mothers. It's statist in the extreme, and I saw this in the McGovern campaign. McGovernism was the beginning of, whether McGovern himself understood this or not, you had the McGovern campaign proclaiming a vast array of rights: a right to housing, a right to a good education. I don't know how you give someone a right to a good education, and these things would have to be enforced by state mandates and by state oversight, and you had an enormously expanded power of the legal profession. And I asked myself, where did this liberalism come from? And what I try to show is modern liberalism does not derive from the New Deal. What we call New Deal liberalism really only held sway for about 30 years, from about 1935 to 1965. Before and after is the kind of liberalism, statist liberalism, anti-middle class liberalism I write about in Revolt Against the Masses. And the core of that liberalism is hostility to small business, to farmers, to independent people who are not organized in some public sector interest group. So when today liberals talk about the middle class, they mean public sector workers. They don't mean a guy who works at Bed Bath and Beyond as a salesman, or works in a factory manufacturing furniture. And so I wanted to see, where did this liberalism come from? And one of the things I realized is that some of the founding fathers of liberalism, Herbert Crowley, the founder of the New Republic, Randolph Bourne, who just had enormous influence on the thinking of the 60s. He's the first to talk about a youth culture. And H.L. Mencken. People say to me, wait a minute, H.L. Mencken, he wasn't a liberal. No, I don't say in the book he's a liberal. I say he's the most important influence on liberals. It's H.L. Mencken more than any other individual who influences the subsequent direction of liberalism, in the sense that what Mencken is about is mocking the middle class, mocking the bourgeoisie. And Mencken was Obama ahead of his time. He felt perfectly free to lie at great length. Mencken. So, you know, we don't have to agree with William Jennings Bryan on evolution to know that in what happened in the Scopes trial in Dayton, Ohio, is that Scopes was never threatened by a mob. He was treated as a hail fellow, well met. This was an attempt to boost the town, local. It was local boosterism. You know, put Dayton on the map. The case was begun by the ACLU. It wasn't begun by people pushing anti-evolution positions. And the part of the trial that people forgot, because they only know it from the play Inherit the Wind or from the Frederick Lewis Allen mistaken take on it, Frederick Lewis Allen's famous book, Only Yesterday, they have this idea that Brian was a kind of buffoonish character. Brian was a world traveler, very well read, and Brian saw the Nietzscheanism inherent in the kind of liberalism that Mencken was pushing. Not accidentally, Mencken wrote the first book on Nietzsche in English, in America. And he saw how ugly this Nietzscheanism could become, as it did become in the 30s under the Nazis, and he saw social Darwinism. Now here we get the figure of Richard Hofstadter, whose book on social Darwinism is one of the worst books of consequence ever written, because social Darwinism, according to Hofstadter, is something that's pushed by conservatives. It's not. Conservatives don't talk about it. Social Darwinism is something that John Dewey talks about. It's something that Richard Ely talks about. The early 20th century important liberal figures. Not that they were neo-Nazi, far from it, but they were in favor of social Darwinism. Because they thought social Darwinism would improve the species, would make us more intelligent. Well, I don't think we're going to become. We might become more or less moral over time, but more or less intelligent, I'm not so sure.
I always like to joke that social Darwinism is the only kind of Darwinism that the left disapproves of, but of course that's because they misunderstand it entirely, right?
Exactly, because they were the only ones who were really social Darwinists.
So is it fair to say, or is this an accurate reading to say that you sort of think that New Deal liberalism and that post-war liberalism, part of which is the consensus school and all the rest of the 50s, is something of an anomaly in the liberal story of the 20th century? It represents a break between these two deeper strains of liberalism that are much worse.
I think that's exactly right. I think New Deal liberalism is egalitarianism, has a strong egalitarian strain, but liberalism itself has a strong anti-egalitarian strain. The liberalism of the 20s, the liberalism that begins in the mid-60s, strong anti-egalitarian. It says that we should be governed by our betters, I did a postscript to the Revolt Against the Masses for the paperback edition, and I almost didn't have to write it. Jonathan Gruber wrote it for me. I mean, I couldn't believe it. Larry Moen, who's at Manhattan Institute, joked to me. He said, "I guess you don't have to write anything. Just print what Gruber said, and you got it." I mean, he embodied that strength.